Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another Northshire Presents virtual event. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel Person, event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs, New York. Tonight, I am delighted to get to introduce Christopher Emdin, professor and program director of science education in the Department of Mathematics, Science, and Technology at Teachers College, Columbia University, where he also serves as associate director of the Institute for Urban and Minority Education. The creator of the Hip Hop Ed social media movement and the Science Genius program, he's the author of the New York Times bestseller For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood and the Rest of Y'all Too, and Urban Science Education for the Hip Hop Generation. He's with us tonight to talk about his new book, Ratchetdemic. And as he speaks this evening, please put any questions that you have into the chat. We will save them up and we will pose them for you at the end of the evening. Please join me in welcoming him to Northshire Presents. And Christopher, why don't you tell us a bit about the book?
Hey, Rachel. Thank you first and foremost for the amazing introduction. And I want to say how excited I am to be able to give this talk at Northshire. Unbeknownst to many folks, it's my local bookshop. I go in the store quite often with my two children. They love rummaging around that second floor and digging up a book. I never get to Northshire and leave empty-handed. I always have amazing books in tow. So I'm thankful to have the opportunity to have this conversation, at my local bookshop. And for all those who are listening, before we delve into the conversation, I want to impress on everyone how important it is for us to support local bookshops. These are spaces that are so essential to our community. They're the backbone of our intellectual thought. And when we put our dollars behind independent bookshops, we support learning and growth and thought. And for those of us who, like me, are interested in education, what other place is there where young folks receive an education or pursue their own education through the books that they select and buy and you bring home and they cuddle up with? So beginning by giving props to Northshire Bookstore, and then I'll get into the talk. This book, Ratchedemic, Reimagining Academic Success, is, it's hard to describe what I mean by Ratchedemic. And so that the subtitle, Reimagining Academic Success, really captures it more than anything else. I feel like we are in a point in time in the world where everyone has adopted some notion of what they think academic success looks like, some idea of what academic excellence looks like, some idea of what college and career ready looks like, some idea of what prepared for the workforce looks like. And the school system oftentimes works to meet those goals, to make those kids ready to be academically successful. And I'm making the argument that we need to reimagine our conception of academic success, that academic success is not content, knowledge, expertise. I'm a science educator with science degrees who wants everyone to be a scientist and to be engaged in the wonder and beauty of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And even though I am so deeply connected to that content area, I also recognize that understanding academic content is not academic success. And when I say reimagining academic success, it's because I believe that reimagining is a verb. Folks think that to reimagine is to sit back and think of something anew. And I think that to reimagine is an active transitive verb. It's a process of thinking anew about how can schools function differently in this era to prepare young people to be ready for the real world. I think about Saratoga, right? This almost idyllic town, city. It has such an amazing history. It's so picturesque. It's in many ways for the imagination of folks, like, the perfect place to grow up. But what happens if you have young folks in an area like that is seemingly perfect by the definition that we prescribe? And young folks go to school, they go to Saratoga High, they go to Boston, they go wherever they go, and they get this education and they get good grades and they go out there and we feel as though they're prepared for the real world. What if we did all the things that we thought were right to do to get them ready for the real world, but yet they were not prepared to be full citizens of the world? They didn't have the heart and the soul and the self-consciousness and the critical media literacy and the love for others and the value for diversity and a recognition that their place where they grew up is a beautiful place. But if they grew up in a beautiful place without recognizing the beauty of generations and people and geographic locations beyond where they come from, that they are not prepared to be academically successful. And so for me, it's this, I wrote this book for us to think about academic success differently and to recognize the limitations of the existing schooling system. to recognize that the way we think it is and the way we sort of idealize it is actually fundamentally broken. Why? Because the system of education as it currently stands only functions to be able to create versions of itself all over again. It only serves as a machine that creates young folks who are clones of adults from 1950 or 1960. That we're creating young people who are built for a different time, who are ill-equipped for this time and this season and this era. And Ratchedemic, that word, that phrase, is intentionally supposed to rub you the wrong way, right? Ratchedemic, I can't look that up in a dictionary. What does that mean? But it has deep meaning, and I think it's essential for young folks and for teachers to be able to understand what that means. What does it mean to be Ratchedemic? Well, I took a colloquial term and word, or the kind of term you'll only hear in Black spaces, when you're like, in Albany or in Brooklyn or in the Bronx, or the word ratchet in those spaces means something. Like, to be ratchet is to exemplify all negative characteristics associated with brownness and Blackness and urbanness. To be ratchet is to be a little loud, to be a little expressive, to be a little bit anti-respectable, to give a little extra in any social space you're in. To be ratchet is what some of you may be thinking I am right now, right? Like, I thought we were getting a Columbia professor to talk about his book, but he's a little expressive, right? I'm a little ratchet. And I think that ratchetness is an identity that a lot of folks who don't fit into the mold of traditional schools end up adopting. And we're not just talking about Black young folks or brown young folks, we're also talking about LGBTQ populations. And we're also talking about any population who within the school does not see the school reflecting who they authentically are, whose voices are not central in the instruction, who feel as though I come into school and I'm not the one that's seen. Anybody who goes into a school and is not seen finds ways to be seen. If you refuse to see young people inside the school, they will find ways to ensure that they're seen. But when they try to find ways that they're seen, they will oftentimes do so in ways that are intentionally and deliberately counter to what you expect or want from them. And they become a little ratchet. They're the kids who are hanging out in a parking lot after school smoking. They're the kids who decide that they're going to play their rap music at volume 50 while they're driving through the suburbs. They choose to enact a thing to make them say out loud to you without words that I am here and I want to be seen and I want to be welcome and I want to be accepted. And for you to be able to be prepared for the real world, you've got to be able to see me, accept me, value me, and be comfortable with me. And so those are the folks who are ratchet. And then to be academic is the traditional definition. And to be academic is not necessarily to be intellectual or to be smart. But to be academic, as we've currently defined it, or as we currently have designed it, is to be poised and quiet, attentive, to raise hands and only spoken to when called upon, to memorize stuff really, really well, even though we have devices where all the things that we're memorizing, we have access to on our phones anyway. To be academic is not to be intelligent, it's to pretend like you're intelligent, it's to perform a self that makes other folks comfortable. And what happens in traditional schools is that teachers who love young people will oftentimes academically compensate young people for complicity rather than preparedness for the real world, right? We like the kids who make us feel good. We like the kids who say good morning. And so what I'm saying is, how do we redefine what it means to be academic and welcome a Ratchedemic energy, which is to say that you could be academically inclined, you could be smart, you could be thoughtful, and you could be a little loud, and you could be a little brown, and you could speak Spanish and English, and you could speak Spanglish, and you could love dancing, and you could be mobile. That we want to reimagine what it means to be academic and prepare all young people to be able to welcome all those selves, so that when they go out into the real world and they leave the nest, they leave this city, they leave this town, they go out to college, they interact with real people, that they have a sensibility to understand the value in others, and then also to understand that everyone has a little ratchet in them, and this is where the book talks to teachers, that you're an effective teacher to the extent to which the students that you're teaching see you as a real person. Teachers oftentimes learn all these things like, don't smile till November. If you're too nice to them, they won't learn from you. Be nice to them only in June at the end of the academic year. Like all these things that we learn about what it requires to be an effective educator, which are actually counter to what it means to be able to connect to young folks. And I make the argument that teachers need to find their ratchet selves, your true selves. Like, who is the you that you are when you're with the people you love? Do you have a sense of humor? Do you love to dance? Do you love to joke? And I'm making an argument that teachers who lead with that really true, authentic self are the ones that connect to young folks. And when you connect to young folks in that way, you don't have to be like the young people, but you can showcase to them that there's space for them to be able to interact with a real person, and then they become a real person for you. So that's like the fundamental argument behind Ratchedemic. Now, that argument is made in multiple ways. And then I at the end of the book, give teachers questions to think about. Like, if you're in a school and you need a professional development book to have conversations about radically different things about teaching and learning, like this is the book, right? And it forces us to be able to step out of our comfort zone. So if I go to the end of the book and the discussion questions, the first theme is identity development. How does a teacher construct their identity? What is the role that you're performing as a teacher that doesn't serve you well as a person who needs to connect to young folks? How are young people constructing identities that's not who they really are? How does a young person who's really, really brilliant, because they're not seen, start performing thug or performing disengaged or performing I don't like school when they really love school? Because we have a system that plays up the performance of an identity that's about respectability and not about intellect. So I talk about identity development. Who are you? How would you describe your multiple identities to your colleagues or to your students? What are the most salient parts of your social identity? I'm posing these questions to teachers so teachers can ask questions of themselves that they've never asked before. Teachers prepare for their work by going to these schools of education. And the schools of education give you the same stuff. Dewey said this, and Vygotsky said this, and Piaget said that. And this is how you design a lesson plan. And these are the standards for New York State. And this is how you get the kids prepared for the Regents. What if I told you that all those things, despite the fact that we've held on to them for decades on end, make no true difference in how young people see themselves as smart and valuable? And what if I told you that a young person that sees themselves as smart and valuable can actually surpass those academic expectations? That the path towards passing the New York State Regents isn't boredom, right? That it's connectedness and it's life and it's joy and it's about finding a true identity. The second chapter, I talk about oppressive systems. And, in this era where folks are, we hear about like banning critical race theory and the boogeyman is coming to infiltrate our schools, and we should all be fearful of, a left wing, like all these things that people just make up that aren't real. Like, why do we get so tethered to these invisible notions of the boogeyman coming to get us, when in reality, that's not the case? Critical race theory is not being taught in any K through 12 schools in the United States, but yet and still politicians say critical race theory is going to be the end of public education. And so I kind of start posing questions to make us think about, like, why are we so fearful of each other? And why do we allow people to construct ideas and theories that make us fearful of each other, to make us ineffective as, and I don't call folks teachers. I talk about youth-facing adults. Ratchetdemic for me is not about teaching in the traditional right? Like I wrote a book that somebody who did not have a teaching credential can pick up and make sense of how to engage with other people. And so like, I don't want to use teacher. I want to use like youth-facing adults. How do youth-facing adults learn how to be able to be authentic people and not be fearful of this invisible boogeyman by getting to understand like who young folks are and who they are? So I write about personal identity, and I write about oppressive systems, and I talk about how oppressive systems maintain themselves, like with sort of political puppetry, that convince folks that they're better off just sticking to the script. Because if I stick to the script, I'll be safe. But what if being safe means unsafety for young people, right? Like, what if a teacher is saying, I'm going to play this thing safe, means that a young person graduates from the school and feels unsafe and feels unprepared for the real world? And what are the implications of that? Then I talk about pedagogy and effective instruction. A lot of folks who are not in education, like pedagogy, that evil word, multi-syllables for no reason. But pedagogy to me is the science of teaching and learning. And I start thinking about and talking about like teaching at the end of the day, it's a performance art. Young people are works of art. And if you start looking at all young people as works of art with diverse backgrounds and different perspectives and different experiences and different histories, all coming together to present themselves to you in the classroom. You as a teacher, you have to be an appreciator of the art that they bring. And if you don't appreciate the art that is who they are, then how do they learn to appreciate themselves? So we go there. And then, I also get a little controversial in the book. I start pushing against a couple of interesting ideas. Like, I write about this concept of the Oreo. You guys should all buy the book and read chapter 4. It's a favorite chapter. We got to talk about the experiences of folks of color who go to work within traditional schools, who find themselves holding up these structures that they know is problematic. And most teachers, I don't believe at all in the rhetoric that's around in the world that says teachers don't really want to teach and they just want some result. I don't believe that. I think I from the depths of my soul, believe that 99% of the teachers who I've met want to do the right thing, want to connect to young folks and want to change the world. And they end up in a system that robs them of their intuition, like the thing that drives them to do the work. And so in the book, I write about this. I write about the difference between institutional knowledge, which is knowledge that is given by institutions, by schools, by districts, by schools of education, and intuitional knowledge, the stuff that drives you to teach to begin with. What made you take that job? And I start playing with the idea that at some point, if your institutional knowledge is only functioning to silence your intuitional knowledge, then what drove you to begin teaching to begin with gets lost. And if the love that drove you to teach in the beginning is lost, then you're no longer a teacher. You're just a cog in a machine of dysfunction. And that, it's a harsh thing to say. It's a hard thing to say. It's a hard thing to write. For me, who have I have a heart of teaching. And I touch upon this in the book. I was a middle school 7th and 8th grade teacher for 5 or 6 years. I taught middle school physics and chemistry for about 8 years. The education research that I do now always brings me back to the classroom. So I don't come to this as the Ivy League professor telling the lowly teachers. I come to this vulnerable, and I write about my mistakes as a teacher. And I write about when I didn't know that my passion for teaching was lost until I wake up one day and realize I'm just going to work on Monday rather than set souls on fire, which is what I signed up to do. And then I write about how do you reclaim that? How do you reclaim your passion for this work? So I go there. I write about elevators, haters, and suckers, which is my framing or my theoretical framework for what happens when teachers who sign up to do good work encounter young people who challenge them, who push them, who make them angry. And I frame those young people as elevators, that those young folks who literally, an elevator takes you higher and they push your buttons. The young folks who push your buttons are your elevators, that they're designed to sort of elevate your consciousness as a human being. Talk about haters, which are, the teacher next door who will always critique you because you bring light to young people and your class is a little bit louder and they enjoy it a little bit more. And folks who've robbed themselves or had their joy robbed from them. See, someone who's had their joy robbed from them, they hate someone who operates with joy. When you show up to work every day and you have a smile on your face, like Patty's face. I don't know if you guys can see the screen, but she has this huge, beautiful smile in her Zoom background. It's people that look on Patty's face should be the look on every teacher's face every single day when they know that what they're doing is signing up to change the world. And the question becomes, what happens? What robs us of that? And how do we reclaim that? And so, yeah, so, just teaching for joy and teaching for celebration of the craft I get into. And then haters, folks who don't want to see you happy, don't want to, you ever had that one teacher in your school? It's well, dude, why do you even work here? It's everything the kids this year are just worse than the kids last year. Oh, the recent scores are going to be awful again this year. Every utterance from their mouth comes from a place of negativity. And, you know, in the book, I make the argument that when you allow folks who have that view of teaching, that view of learning, that view of education, and that view of young people, when you allow them to deposit those words about our craft into the air, they just sit there and coagulate with other words. And before long, we have these clouds of negativity and dysfunction that hover over our school buildings, that teachers and school safety officers and principals breathe in. And you say, wow, that's such an amazing school. They have such amazing resources. Look at the football field. Look at all the things they have. It should be great here, but it's not great because we allowed folks to deposit that stuff into the air. And so I write about how do we clear the air of those folks who are not here for young people and don't believe in the transformative power of teaching and learning. So I write about that in the Elevators, Haters, and Suckers chapter. I also, as I admitted earlier, I'm a science geek and a science dweeb. I have degrees in the sciences. Like I'm an anthobiochemist by training before I went into teaching. I got a master's in natural sciences from RPI. So this is like mesenchymal stem cell research. And so I've always been fascinated by the intersections of like sort of like sociology and psychology and teaching, but also like the science that impacts teaching. And so I go a little bit into like epigenetics in here, and I talk about the ways that social conditions actually can impact our genetic makeup and impact the way that we show up in the world. And I give some really powerful examples from the world of science that can help us make sense of how young folks develop certain identities and certain personalities. And so there's a sociological framing and a psychological framing and like an education thing that wraps it up, and like I sprinkle a little bit of science fairy dust on it all. And the idea is to be ratchet in the book, right? Like, because to be ratchedemic is to be both ratchet and academic. I tried to create an academic book that was ratchet. If you read the book, you'll find that in certain moments, certain lines rhyme. Because I was an aspiring rapper as a 9th grader. And so like, I have like, so there are lines that rhyme, and then there are historical context, and there are scientific theories. And I kept sprinkling those magical things throughout the book, while at the same time writing a book that was about a necessary shift in the world of education, and a call for what I call a Ratchedemic energy. And then I guess I'll close this up by saying, you know, the last chapter of the book is also really, did I say like elevated? I said chapter 4 is my favorite, but I don't mean that. My last chapter is my favorite. I love all the chapters. I write about the rights of the body. So like all the rights that young folks deserve by virtue of existing in the world, and how educators must give young folks those rights. And that if we rob them of their rights of the body, their rights to be here, their rights to citizenship, their rights to agency, the rights to power, the rights to question, the rights to potential, the right to imagination, if we rob young folks of those fundamental rights that all people deserve, then we are not teaching them. One of my favorite sayings that I hope this book kind of gives folks is that, you know, teaching without love is just talking. And anyone can talk to kids. It takes a special person to love them, to love their craft, to love themselves, and to love to teach. And this book is about returning back to the love of teaching. I guess last thing before we get into questions or thoughts, or before Rachel poses things, is like, you know, I wrote a previous book that did pretty well. You know, for white folks who teach in the hood, it's a seminal text in education now, and I'm always flabbergasted by folks like, I was reading this in my school of education, or and I've always found it really humbling that that book has meant so much to so many people, even folks who don't teach in quote unquote the hood. But this one's different. This one's like my heart, my soul, my guts, like the stuff that, like the fire in my belly about this system that I felt needed to be said. And I think anybody who loves the art and craft and science of teaching, and who recognizes that we've gone so far away from the essence of the craft, I think those folks will love this book. Yeah, so with that, that's what I have to offer. If you pick it up and you're reading and you want to talk to me about it, I'm on social media, like at Chris Emdin on Twitter and at Chris Emdin on Instagram. I love talking to people who bought my work and debating and arguing about it, but all from a place of love. Thank you so much for having me today, Rachel. I'll take any questions you have or anyone else may have. And yeah, we all done.
Awesome. This is amazing. So interesting and so important. So thank you for sharing everything. Audience, please type any questions that you have in the chat, though I have some of my own, so I can ask them too. But we do have a great kickoff question from Patty asking, are there any schools or classrooms in New York State that are Ratchetdemic right now? And how can we use those as models if they exist?
Oh, thanks, Patty. That's a great question. There are a few. So a lot of the work, like my work, like I'm not an armchair scholar, right? Like I'm not like he sits and writes books. Like I'm in schools weekly. Like even in the midst of pandemic, I've been visiting schools, traveling to schools, zooming into classrooms. So there are a couple of exemplars across the country. I would say right now, my favorite school that's sort of taken up a Ratchedemic philosophy is called High Tech High in San Diego, California. And High Tech High accepts visitors. You can come see it anytime. You can reach out to me. I can connect you with that school. They do amazing, amazing work. I will also say, like, that's a Ratchedemic school. I think that they really get the concept. Ratchedemic classrooms are elsewhere. They're always Ratchedemic educators. My son's downstairs in the middle of this. He recovered from a little fall today, so he's getting extra love all day. So please indulge me for having the 4-year-old in the background. But there are classrooms across the state of New York. There's Murray Curie High School in the Bronx, New York. There's a classroom in there that is getting to this work. I've done some work this summer with Lincoln Center for the Performance Arts, where we're creating a sort of Ratchedemic classrooms where you can actually see a physical space that is Ratchedemic. Example of a post-pandemic classroom, so you could connect with me and I could share what that place looks like. So there are spaces and places and people who are pushing. But Patty, what I would say is, your classroom can be the Ratchedemic classroom or the classrooms that you're in. And, one thing I love to do is connect with educators or school leaders and work with them to create spaces to allow that Ratchedemic energy to be present. I do a lot of school coaching and teacher coaching to create those spaces for young people.
Thank you. That's a great answer. I was wondering, listening to you talk, a friend of mine who's a teacher often says that her theory is that most of the people who become teachers because the system worked for them. That many people are the people, it's sort of, she says it's split between the people for whom the system really worked and the people for whom the system really didn't. And I wonder how you reach teachers who are the ones who are there because the system as it is always worked for them. How do you reach those people and explain to them that things do need to change?
I think you reach those who it worked for by speaking to their humanity first and foremost, and saying, like, if in the book I actually write about this a little bit. I write about the process of cloning, and in the biological process of cloning, what usually happens is you take one cell and then you have the other. One, you extract out all the genetic material, and then you infuse that with the genetic material of a foreign cell. And when you do that, for example, if you talk about Dolly the sheep, that was done up 277 times. And eventually one took. And the one that took became a clone and it carried the genetic material and went out to fruition. And I think oftentimes we focus on the one that became the clone and not the 276 who rejected it. And I always say it's great that you made it, but look at everybody around you who didn't. That oftentimes wakes them up. And then a lot of folks who were successful in school were only successful to a certain extent. And sometimes you have to reveal to them the areas in which they were broken, right? Like I got really good grades. I memorized a lot and I stayed up all night to 4 a.m. and memorized stuff, but I don't know anything more than what I studied. Or I did really great in school because I passed that class, and after that class was over, I forgot all of it. And then the next year is starting all over again. And then sometimes you have to ask them, like, you were successful in school, but like, did it work for you? Right? Like, and when you ask folks those deep questions, it worked in so much as it made me want to replicate it, but not to the point where I feel fulfilled and feel whole and feel welcome. So I always start with, like, let's look at all those who didn't do well, right? Those who didn't make it. And as we look at them, can't we identify brilliance and genius and smartness and potential in them? So why didn't they make it? Not because they're bad, but because the system's broken. Then we look at those who did make it, right? And those who did make it, did you leave it feeling whole and full and actualized and fulfilled fully, or did you do it just because you felt success in this one small bracket of your life? And that conversation really opens up a lot. It uncovers a lot of wounds. A lot gets revealed. I write about in my work this concept of the ways that teachers compensate kids academically, not for their intelligence, but their complicity. I mean, it's really fascinating. The kids who are quiet and attentive get the higher grades. And I've done a research study with my team across 150 schools in Northeastern United States, where we looked at the kids who got the highest grades on their report cards and the kids who did not do well on their report card grades. And then we looked at their actual exams. And we looked at the content knowledge acquisition of all the young folks. And what we found is that all the young folks actually understood the same amount of content. So then why did some get better grades than others? Because they were compensated for things that had nothing to do with being intellectual or academic, but rather for things that made the teachers feel comfortable, or there were performances of intelligence. So a kid would get like a 90 in a class and then like get a 65 on the Regents. You'd be like, oh my gosh, this Regents was just bad this year. No, the Regents wasn't bad that year. That kid didn't know that much. And we have to be upfront about that. And I think that we operate with a lot of dishonesty in the interest of maintaining the structure of schools as it is. We're really critical about whether or not this thing is working for everyone. We realize it isn't. In fact, I would also argue, if you look at folks who are most successful, most innovative in a number of disciplines, in the sciences, in business, in art, they were not the kids who did great in school. Like we're not honest about this, but we have to be, right? Einstein was a C student. Bill Gates hated school, they may have stumbled through school, or they may have struggled through school, or they may have found their passions later, but they succeeded in spite of school, not because of it. And then I think about those who were really great in school. They got A's in every semester, and they were valedictorian. They were the most amazing folks ever when they were in school, based on this idea of conformity. And then look at where they are 20 and 30 and 50 years later. What was academic success in the conventional way really an indicator of their potential in life? Nah. And I think what we need to do is reimagine our concept of academic success to ensure that all folks leave schools able to be fully fulfilled. And right now, we're not doing that. And I think Ratchedemic gets us to start doing that.
Thank you. There's a wonderful comment and question from Jennifer, which I'm going to share next. She says, thank you so much for being here. I work with pre-service teachers in a local teacher prep program. We read for white folks, and it's life-changing for many of them, as they learn that the way they were taught doesn't have to be the way that they teach. I'm really excited to read and introduce your new book to them. I'm grateful that you're doing this work. And the question, how do I help my new teachers to keep the fire and fight to change the system rather than revert to what has always been?
I want to begin by saying thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate that comment. It warms my soul, and it means the world to me to know that you're doing that work and that you're introducing my work to those teachers. And, this is what I say to new teachers all the time. And it's more important now than ever before. It's impossible to remind them too much that they are the ones who are going in there to transform the system as we know it, and that they're life changers, they're earth shifters and shatterers. And I think when we do a lot of teacher prep, we try to hide the severity and the significance of this moment. Every time I give a talk, a speech, a conversation, in an era of insurrections on the Capitol and the fight for Black lives and the devaluing of asylum seekers and the kids having their social life interrupted, and COVID, and like in the midst, like this time that we're in is unlike any other I can ever think of. And the only other moments in our history I can think of that were alike now were like marches for civil rights on Washington. And this is not hyperbole. I don't think that there are any moments in our collective history where there is so much angst and fervor and like anticipation of what's next to come, like where we're in a moment of like pregnant with an idea of what the next generation will look like. And I believe that those who choose to teach in the midst of this time are the ones who are the equivalent to those who led us to all the things that gave us what we have today. Like those who marched on Washington for us to have the rights we have now, the equivalent of them are those who choose to teach in this season. And Jennifer, I would say, remind your teachers of that. That when they walk into a classroom, they're not taking a job, that they're literally ushering in a new vision of a new possibility, or new definition of academic success, a new definition of what schools could look like. And I think if you impress upon them the significance of the larger work, the fire in their belly remains. How could it not?
Amazing. I'd love to hear more about your journey to becoming an educator, because it seems like, I mean, this is the work you have to be doing. I mean, it's so clear that this is a passion for you. And I wonder how that happened for you.
Yeah, I mean, you got me pegged. If I couldn't teach, if I couldn't talk about this powerful work to educate, I couldn't breathe. It's my life's work, it's my calling. And I found it by accident. I went to public schools in New York City and didn't have the best time, and had aspirations to be anything but a teacher because those guys were so awful. And then I went to undergrad, and literally stumbled into college because I had to go to college because my mom was like, "You're going to college. I don't, you're going." So I stumbled in, and I was like, "Oh, this is crazy." And I went to an advisor, and the advisor said, "Look, what do you want to major in?" I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Well, one tactic to get through this thing and do okay is to take all the hard classes now, and then you can take all the other classes later." I said, "Well, what are the hard classes?" I went through the list, and it was the science classes. And I was like, "All right, I'll take intro to biology freshman year." And then I get into this class, and one of the professors said, "Who wants to do research in my lab?" Like, who would volunteer to do research in your lab? No one. It's like, "Well, who would do research in my lab for extra credit?" And I was like, "Me," because I already knew I was going to need the extra credit. But my world opened up when I went into a science lab, because I realized how different the science laboratory is from my science classes. In my science classes, I had to memorize stuff, I had to know stuff, I had to spit it back out, I had to do all this homework, and I had to be boring, and it was too complex and layered for no reason. And then doing science was like doing stuff. I went into the lab and there was music playing. I'm like, "How can you guys do science and play music?" Like, it's, if music excites you, we play it in the backdrop. The Dr. Liesel Jones said, "You want to wear a lab coat?" I'm like, "A lab coat? That's so boring. That's because you don't like how I dress." She's like, "No, I actually love how you dress. You're putting on a lab coat not to not show off your outfit, but I want to preserve your outfits and nothing exposed." And I was like, "Wait, science is actually like music and can dress well." I love the visuals. I love aesthetics. I love fancy hats and cool glasses. And so aesthetics speak to me. And so I was like, wait, I can listen to music. I can dress well. I can pose questions. No one wants answers from good scientists. They want people to pose good questions. And I started realizing that doing academic work is different than doing school. But so many young people get put off by school, they never get to see the wonder and beauty of learning. And when that revelation came, my world shifted, because I started for the first time believing that I was smart. And schools never told me that before. They never told me I was smart. They never told me I asked good questions. They never told me I could show up as myself. I could dress well. I could listen to music and still read. I was always forced to choose between these binaries, right? Either be smart or be uncool. Either be ratchet or be academic. And I've come to recognize that you could be both, right? And I want all young folks to understand, Aaron, yes, that interdisciplinarity is the essence of living. Hybridity is the essence of life. When people from multiple perspectives and backgrounds and experiences and loves and passions come together and respect each other as they come together, Amazing things happen. And that should be schooling as well. And so once that hit, I got a job in the science, went to grad school, did science work, was working in science for a little bit, and realized that nothing spoke to me more than wanting more young people who, like me, were like the ones who weren't smart and weren't good and weren't this and weren't that, who now is like the biggest science dweeb and geek in the world. I'm like, why can't we open this up for everyone? Like, I want learning to be democratic. I want everybody to see that they can be intelligent on their own terms. The things that turn me on in life are like that make me excited are like, I love seeing like, the cool kid talking about a good book they read, the kid who dresses well, that's obviously fashion conscious, having a conversation in the cafeteria about string theory, kids doodling about scientific formulas, kids making comic books about the nuances of art and atomic structure. And I think that doesn't happen. And I think that Ratchedemic gets us there. And so that's part of the journey that got me to teaching. And the journey that got me to teaching is the journey that got me to this work. I can't overstate like how much this book means to me, because it's like I've written other books, but it's like the book that's my heart, and it's the book that captures what I see that's wrong about the current system, but also what I see as the immense and powerful possibilities if you choose to look at it differently. So that's a bit of my journey.
Thank you. Aaron has a really interesting comment, looking for you to comment on it, saying, I'm struck here by the really fluid discussion between sciences and arts and humanities, and the way that integrated knowledge seems fundamental to the Ratchetdemic idea. Can you speak to that interdisciplinarity a bit?
Absolutely. I think that subjects are social constructs. And if we look at the history of the STEM subjects, what we'll oftentimes find is that they were grouped together because they were the subjects historically. They were supposed to be for the best and the brightest and the smartest. And the best and the brightest and the smartest were those who worked closely with the church at the time, and they held the most power. And we have a history in those subjects of like that being for only the good, the best, the smartest, the most intelligent, not because that's what it is, but just because it's what we inherited. I find that my conversations with artists are the most amazingly beautiful, brain stimulating and titillating conversations ever. And folks will reduce that to being superficial. And I'm like, how? For my next book, and I hate to talk about my next book now, but I'm really proud about this next one. I go back to my work in STEM. It's called STEM, STEAM, Make, Dream. It'll be out in January. In that book, I interviewed like all these amazing scientists. Like I interviewed Neil deGrasse Tyson and Joaquin Frank and like, astronauts and like all these brilliant scientists. And what I found in my conversations with them is they have these artistic beings. Joaquin Frank won the Nobel Prize in chemistry a couple years back. And I was asking him questions about how he came to win this Nobel Prize. And he's like, Chris, like, you know what I really don't get to talk about that I want to talk about? I'm a fiction writer. I was like, you won a Nobel Prize in chemistry. You're a writer of fiction? And he goes, yeah, like my creativity to do the work in the sciences is birthed out of my swimming deeply in myself as writer. That blew my mind. It blew my mind that Neil deGrasse Tyson said straight up, like, I'm known as this sort of astrophysicist, but who would want to live in a world without art? Like, but you're the physics guy that talks about the cosmos. And so I think that what I'm trying to do in Ratchetdemic is to lay the groundwork for the concepts in STEM, STEAM, Make, Dream, to be honest with you, right? And it's to let us know that these things are social constructs that folks made up, that we held on to. And science is a language. Math is a language. And some folks get to be fluent in the language and some folks don't. But fluency with a language is based upon how much time you spend with it. There are no science people or math people. There's just folks who were told that they were science people, and because of that, spent more time with it. And so they took the time to understand it. And a ratchetdemic philosophy helps us to get to understand the concept behind STEM, STEAM, Make, Dream. This summer, I'm a science educator. And as I mentioned earlier, I do some work, not now, as a scholar in residence at Lincoln Center for the Performance Arts. We're like, why do they have you come for Lincoln Center? That's like the battle, that's like the Juilliard place. Like, but I thought you said you were a scientist. Well, those folks are recognizing that it's at the intersection of science and math and the arts that really powerful collisions happen. That advances not just scientific thought, but also artistic performance. And I think that we are at a point where if people buy the concept of Ratchedemic, they start walking towards STEM, STEAM, Make, Dream.
Thank you. I'm really struck by all this talk about those connections between the humanities and the sciences. Yeah. And I wonder, it seems like your science training must inform your research in a lot of ways as you're doing research into pedagogy. I know that's the word we don't like, but as you're doing that research. Could you talk a little bit about how that training has impacted your work?
Absolutely. As a scientist, what I am more than anything else is a fan of those who've worked in the sciences to have the most amazing breakthroughs. Like, so, my training in the sciences led me to recognize that I could be a scientist. And then the more I did work in the sciences, the more I started realizing that there are also, there are hierarchies, even in the sciences. So they're the science workers, then in the science, I call them bosses, because I gotta use my hip hop lingo, right? So they're the folks who work in the sciences who are like doing all the grunt work and the grunt work. And they're no different than folks who are doing works in like a factory or like a call center. Like they get to say it's the sciences because they got a degree in it, but they're just like plug and play, Then there are those who are moving the culture forward. And those folks are always creative, always thoughtful, always artistic. So what I did was I actually made a list of the most influential and powerful scientists ever. And I said to myself, I'm going to study these folks and find out what made them tick. And I named these things. I feel like I'm talking about Ratchedemic and STEM, STEAM, Make, Dream at the same time. But in STEM, STEAM, Make, Dream, I named all the things that made them what they were. And I call them the science-mindedness skills. And what I noticed was they all made really keen observations. They sat with things and looked and looked and looked. They didn't make rash decisions. They sat still and observed. They were all very anti-authoritarian. Everybody said one thing. I think it's the other. I'm going to observe till I find the other, from Galileo to Niels Bohr to Kekule, like same. So they're keen observations, anti-authoritarian. They all thought in metaphor and analogy. It's always like, what can I compare this to make it make the most sense? They were all very curious. And so they all told a lot of stories. And so I looked at all these attributes of all these prolific scientists, and then I brought those skill sets to who I was and trained myself to develop those skills. Then I brought that lens to how I look at teaching and learning and education. So I look at education from a scientific perspective to critique the sort of like unimodal and discipline focused and, dare I say, like Cartesian, Newtonian, Baconian approach to teaching and learning that's all about observable phenomena, but not deep observation. And I bring that critique to my work in education. And then as a teacher and as a researcher, I don't just want to trouble it. I want to offer possibilities. I want to offer paths forward.
So we've got a great follow-up comment from Aaron. I'm just saying, as a humanist, art historian, cultural historian, I very much appreciate this discussion and to find ways to see interdisciplinarity expressed across grades, primary and secondary schools, not just undergraduate and graduate study.
Well, Aaron, I hate to break this to you, but you're Ratchedemic, right? Like, or actually I'm excited to break this to you because, when the slashes as a humanist slash art historian slash cultural historian slash, you see, when you introduce yourself as all the slashes that are in your being and you wear them all at the same time, that's Ratchedemic. That's what I want to get young folks to get to. Like, I am a basketball playing athlete who loves physics and motorcycles, and I'm all of those things at once. And folks, you know, there's this saying, like, you know, jack of all trades and master of none. And I make the argument that that phrase was made and is said by folks who are so boring they could only do well at one thing. You could be a jack of all trade and excellent at all, or carve out a new trade in world and vision. And it doesn't mean that you're losing anything. It actually means that you're walking into all your beauty and magic. And I want us all to get to the point where we can do that.
We are sadly almost out of time, but I would love to end with one last very optimistic question, because this has been such an optimistic evening. I wonder, what about sort of your current crop of students, the current teachers that you are seeing coming up in the world, gives you the most hope and joy?
Oh, they fill me with hope daily. I was in a book study with a bunch of teachers yesterday from across the country who proudly call themselves Ratchedemic educators. And I just said, the kids are gonna be okay. So it's in the enthusiasm for those who are choosing to teach. It's also in the, you know, the fervor with which young people now are like, you know, I'm a freshman in college and I think I want to teach. Like, there was an era for a while where it was like, oh, maybe it's my second calling or my third choice. But we have a generation of young folks now who are like, I'm not satisfied with the way it is. Like, I really want to teach. I'm also really, really in awe of the ways that young people show up on social media. I think there's something really powerful when we are able to utilize these new tools and connect them to academic work. And I think that young folks are so savvy that all teachers have to do is meet them on their own cultural turf and then introduce academic content, and the level of content knowledge increases. So I'm really excited about the educators who are on social media utilizing it as a tool to be able to engage with young folks. And like, it's gonna sound a little corny, but you know, I'm inspired and feel hopeful by the look in the eyes of children. You know, after this crazy year, interruption of social life as we know it, and isolation. I've been in Zoom classrooms and even physical classrooms in the last couple weeks, and I still see a bright future. I still see infinite potential. I still see amazing possibilities, and you know, my hope is that teachers don't snuff that out, because kids had that 10 years ago and 50 years ago and 100 years ago, and I'm hopeful because they have it now. And if they have it now and we spark it, the kids are gonna be okay.
That is an incredible note to end on. This has been such an incredible evening. I knew very little about education and what goes into it before this, and I feel like I've learned a tremendous amount, and it's been a real gift getting to hear you speak tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. You know, this is one of my favorite bookstores. I'm there so often, and to be able to do something associated with Northshire means the world to me. And I'll see you guys in person soon.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, audience, for being here. You can order Ratchetdemic at northshire.com if you haven't already. I think Chris is going to be dropping into signed copies tomorrow, so we will have autographed copies very, very soon. You can request one of those when you order. And thank you, everyone, so much, and have a great night.
Thank you all for being here.